opened up the door. Cool. We are officially, everything's open. We got panelists, or we got people coming in registered. Everybody hopefully that ordered their Jimmy John's has their Jimmy John's delivered to them. I know we got ours here. So let's see, Tony's in and we've got the registrants. Everybody's piling in. This is good. This is good. We'll get everybody room to get seated, so to speak. So, you know, get seated, get settled. Too funny. Like when we used to all meet live.
The good old days.
Yeah, exactly. You remember that, right?
Yeah.
Too funny. So, well, good deal. Well, with this, all right, good. We've got everybody in. We'll give it a minute or two. And we'll get things started. All right, good. Got a good note from Tony. She's able to get in and fixed her technical issues. Nothing like restarting a computer to get that thing kicked off. So that's good. And Tony's active with us. Fantastic. Cool. We're going to let everybody get in. And perfect. I'm going to send Tony a quick little note just to see. All right, so that takes care of that. Perfect. We got, it is 12:01. We're going to get this party started. So hello, everybody. Welcome. And this is our one in a series that we do, just providing information to our agents. We're really honored to have Jessica Massad here, founder and owner of Collateral Management. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about her background, and then we're going to get started. I have a list of 15 questions that I got from all of you as I was polling people in the last couple of weeks. And so we'll go through those questions, but then you guys will have an opportunity to ask questions in the chat section. Tony's already put some information in there. She's going to be kind of managing that for me. And then we'll go from there. So first of all, Jessica, again, thank you. But Jessica, I'm going to read her bio. She is the owner and CEO of Collateral Management. She has over 20 years appraisal management experience. And let's see, her responsibilities. Well, we're going to skip the responsibilities. We got to get into what she's done. Responsibilities include oversight of all residential and commercial products. Prior to founding Collateral Management in 1998, she founded the Appraisal Firm, a real estate appraisal firm that serviced several Midwest states. She's been licensed for over 2 decades and holds a certified residential appraiser's license in Florida, Virginia, and Wisconsin. In 2009, Collateral Management opened its doors. Since then, Jessica has become a member of several professional organizations, including Mortgage Brokers Association, the TAVMA, you'll have to tell me what that is, the Florida Association of Mortgage Professionals, Better Business Bureau, and the Appraisal Group. So Jessica has, I think I mentioned to you guys, yeah, there is a whole page of education that I'm not going to read. So, but the whole page of education that she's done. So we're really happy to have Jessica here. And before we get started in the questions, you guys made a lot of comments to me about a holiday that, you know, last time we had this, it was around St. Patrick's Day. So I guess today is Happy Weed Day. So I wear a hat for that. In a second, we'll get that out of here. So anyway, so apparently that's what 420 is. So welcome everybody. And so I had some comments about the hat. So Tony and I had to get a good hat, but I don't think I'm going to wear that the whole, it's not a good look for the whole class. So that being said, welcome, Jess. Thank you again for being here. We're going to start with questions. And again, you guys can fill questions in. This is more question and answer and less of having you guys, less of a PowerPoint. We just felt like the questions that we gathered and the questions you guys will have are the most important thing. So here's probably one of the most pressing questions on everybody's mind. Jessica, how are these overpriced listing contracts appraising? So how are we getting these things to appraise in this market?
So that's a great question for 2021. I would say that in most cases, and they're not always appraising, which is a huge thing that we'll probably get into later on in this conversation, but I think it's about being creative, you know, and it's looking at the big difference for us as appraisers is we're always looking in the past. So our past value is not going to be anywhere near contracts that you're getting and these bidding wars and things like that. So it comes down to something as creative as, okay, well, here's my community, and maybe my community caps at $400,000, but this neighboring community just had 3 sales that closed and they're at $325,000. So they're maybe utilizing 1 or 2 sales from our community, going to that neighboring community to bring up that value and just kind of adapting it. And for the people moving forward, I think it'll be much easier, but for the people that started in the beginning of all this, that was a huge obstacle, and a lot of those contracts didn't come in, and there was a lot of renegotiating. But hopefully if we stay in line with that and keep moving forward and keep getting a little more creative with that, then we can at least come very close to those contract prices.
Yeah, that's so, and that's there was kind of a follow-up to that is, you know, I think sometimes appraisers want to know, or realtors, I should say, want to know how you guys justify hitting a higher value than the highest sale in the subdivision. And I understand that there's some appraisal rules that allow you guys to exceed the highest appraisal in the subdivision. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, it kind of wraps around what we just said. Should they know? Does it necessarily meet underwriting requirements? Not always, but written correctly, it can make sense, and they can, I guess, quantify the difference. So, you know, maybe we cap it, whatever it is, 300,000, and the neighboring one is 325, but we're at 325. We've hit the maximum for both communities. If we can value that property and maybe be able to show those improvements, or maybe it's a new construction or whatever it is, I think that's huge and very sensitive in that situation, because we're scraping for every dollar. So I think that's a good situation where all those things that as agents you guys put in, and all the upgrades and all that information that normally an appraiser might not necessarily focus in on or care about, in that situation, I think that we can push that to the highest possible limit and use that, you know, as something to kind of run with and say, okay, well, we're not over improved, but we are at the highest point of our market and we can justify it, and here's why.
So the kind of a follow-up to that, and question number 2 is, and I think this was just, you know, are you guys meeting, you know, they're being surprised. I think a lot of agents are, you know, when I talk to them, they're like, oh my gosh, that made value. We didn't think it would get there. Yeah. So, you know, and one thing I wanted to preface on the last conversation too, before we get into this next question, is one thing I want agents to understand is, even though the appraiser makes value, that appraisal still has to go through underwriting. Mm-hmm. And there's a couple different levels on our end that appraisal is viewed. Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, for example, have risk numbers that they assign to those valuations. And if they think that the valuation is high, it's going to get, I think it works out to be a lower number, a higher number. I forget how the schedule goes, but at some point, higher. Thank you. So the higher the number, the more the risk. And then we might have to do something like a desk review or a field review or things like that. So the one thing I wanted to preface is, just because the appraiser made the number, underwriting still has to agree with the number. So just a little note, you guys aren't officially out of the woods until the underwriting says, yep, you're good. So, all right. This is an interesting question. It was, Jessica, are you guys meeting these values because of the volume? Meaning that you're just doing so many appraisals right now. Is that one of the reasons that you're meeting the values?
No, it's actually the opposite. When appraisers get busy, they tend to pull back, because now they see they have a very strong income coming in. They have a huge flow. So it would be more reason for them to not bring it in anymore. When it's the middle of winter and you have one deal that you're working on, you're going to fight a little harder for it. So it's actually the opposite. But I think that, you know, in the markets that you're in, I think you've built out a great panel of appraisers. I think they're people that we rely on, we have good relationships with, and that has a lot to do with it. We could turn around and order that same appraisal from someone else, and the value may not be there, and it may not even be close, which happens very often. So it's about making sure you're utilizing experienced people who know their market and can communicate. If there's a problem, whether they're talking to the agent or they're talking to us, we at least have some feel for what's happening within that file instead of getting a big surprise.
Yeah, that's a great point. So, the appraisal guidelines, appraisal rules changed a decade plus ago in reference to the relationship we as a lender can have with our appraisers. And ultimately, the need for companies like Collateral Management is they're an appraisal management company. And then we as mortgage lenders all have panels within those appraisal management companies. Now, we're blessed in the sense that we have to have a random selection of appraisals, obviously, appraisers, excuse me, but the panel can be built by us. So for the most part, everybody in our panel are all really high quality guys that really know their stuff. And I think we get less appraisal challenges here because of that. So that's a really, really good thing. And again, the link is open if you guys have questions. We've still got a bunch to go through, but feel free to throw your questions in there. So here's a question for you, Jessica. Are the appraisers going to be comfortable with high values because of a bubble popping?
No, I think there's going to be a lot of challenges, but the only good thing is even when that happens, you're working in the past. So you have a solid 6 to 8 months before all those sales are used up and we're moving into a new market. And then at that point, maybe listing prices are going to adjust and things will change. So I don't know if there's a huge concern for it, only because we're working in the past. So I think it actually solves our problem, even knowing that it's probably going to pop. It really wouldn't matter. You're good for a very good period of time before that market adjusts.
Yeah, and like everything, what goes up must come down and vice versa. Rates have been going down, now they're coming up. The market's been going up, eventually it'll correct and come down. I think the biggest, people, the media particularly are saying, oh my gosh, it's going to pop, it's insane, things can't go on like this. But the basic rules of business is supply and demand. And there's no supply. And as long as the demand remains there, and I think if we keep rates under 4%, which certainly seems to be predictable over the next 12 to 18 months, I don't foresee any reason for the demand to go away. So, but again, eventually things will correct themselves. All right. So, what's up? Oh, okay. This is a great one. So we're going, what do we do if an appraiser undervalues a property? What do we as a real estate agent, what steps do we as a real estate agent need to take? What's the best practice, Jessica, for an agent to dispute a low value?
I think coming back with data and less opinion, and I think when anything gets emotional, it tends to not be as helpful as we need it to be. So, you get a short appraisal back and maybe you used these 5 sales to project your listing price and it's accurate and this is why, and here's my improvements. And that's the kind of information and the feedback that we need to push to the appraiser, rather than were you drinking when you did this appraisal or whatever it is. It's like less emotion and just facts. And then that's the part that we step in and we do our job and we say, okay, this makes sense. We need to get this fixed. How do we fix it? And let us do that part of it. But I think from the agent standpoint, even when you do list your price, think about it from the standpoint of that data that you use, you will probably need to use again in the future when that appraisal happens, especially in a market like we have today where, the past sales aren't really meeting up to what's happening with contracts. So that data becomes much more important from that standpoint. And there are so many cases where we get the appraisals turned over and we do get the value pushed up, and maybe it's not the exact amount, but it's enough to get them to closing. And I think that's really important. So focus on, appraisers only work on closed sales. So, we don't want to focus in on what's listing, what's pending, what's happening right now. Again, they're in the past. So the past 6 months is basically where any value they extract is going to come from. So that's where your focus should be.
And the follow-up on that is what's considered a good comp, and this is kind of an area I see. We'll get a low appraisal. The listing agent is the first one that's tasked to figure out, hey, show me some comps, like you mentioned, that you use to establish this listing price in the first place. but send me some comparables. And a lot of times I'll see 2-story comparables when we appraise the ranch. But what are the other more obvious things that you see as mistakes? Or maybe a better portion is, what should they be looking for as a good comp?
I think a good range is to calculate about a 20% variance, whether it's square footage, whatever you're looking at, age of the property, distance. I think location should be very important. If you're trying to sell a point, stick with your location, stick with the subject location. The style of the home, it's not a deal breaker, but I think that it tends to shy away the second they get it and they look and they say, oh, this is a 2-story, mine's a 1-story, and they sort of shut down. You don't want that. So you want to sell it right up front and say, okay, you want to give them data, but not too much data. Nobody wants to see a CMA that's 36 pages with everything in there. It's too much for them to look at. So we simplify it and we say, okay, here's 2 to 3 sales. This is our point. And that's it. And we leave it at that. And most of the time you're going to get it turned over with that information. If you start adding to it, it's too much. So when you're searching for those sales, that 15 to 20% range is very safe. And it's hard for an appraiser to come back and argue and say, well, I can't use that. Well, why not? It's probably just as equal as the ones he has, if not better. And the big thing is, again, focusing on location and then the age of the sale. So if our appraiser comes back and all his sales are 6 to 8 months, and you provided me one that sold in 60 days, he's going to have a really hard time saying, no, I can't use that sale. I think it's very legitimate and it's a very strong point. And it's not always available, but when we do have that, I think that that's a great way to prove, here's our current market, and that was 6 to 8 months ago. So obviously mine is better. Yeah. And then usually at a very minimum, we'll have him add it and then see how it impacts the final value and try to figure out, okay, do we move forward with maybe potentially getting another appraisal, or do we go back to this guy and see, what else can be done?
That's a great point. And Paul's got a long question in here. I'll get into that in a second, but John made a good point that, proximity or school district. So, and proximity or school district, I believe, is really a question mark. And that's kind of an interesting point. Would a comparable, as long as you brought it in the same school district, is that more important than the distance that property is from the house?
No. Appraisers are told not to consider school district, even though that sounds absolutely ridiculous.
Really?
We're not actually supposed to even mention the school district in the report. And most of the time it's not in there. Yeah. It goes back to discrimination laws and all these different things and steering people. So I would say absolutely proximity.
Proximity. Okay, that's interesting. I didn't know there was guidelines against that. So I learned something today too. So there's another comment in here about what about, and this is John's comment, what about size of the property versus quality of the property? So I think, one thing that I've seen when I get these comparables back from listing agents is, if we did an 1,100 square foot ranch, you can't send me 1,800 square foot ranches. It just doesn't work. So, I mean, I think your 20% rule is probably pretty good. So 20%, we can go to about 1,400 square feet would be a decent number.
Yep. Well, if you think of it from the standpoint of a buyer's market, if somebody's shopping for an 1,100 square foot home or vice versa, an 1,800 square foot home, they're not going to buy the opposite. One's just not going to match their needs. It doesn't make any sense. It would have to be, the biggest thing is it would have to appeal to that same buyer. So there would be no reason why somebody would need an extra 700 square feet if they're shopping for 1,100 square feet.
Yeah, no question. I think you're getting extra bedrooms and things like that, obviously. So maybe even extra bathrooms and things. So Paul's question, and I think if I remember right, Paul deals in a little bit older homes, but maybe vintage style homes. So I have to read this because it's a little bit long, but old homes are very different from each other, older homes. They seem to be harder to appraise than the suburban homes. That is like so many others, even though square foot number of bedrooms might be equal, so many aspects of the houses will be different, I guess, as they're older homes. And he's probably talking about more like non-production subdivisions, Yet there is so much emphasis put on comparable size and number of rooms and not enough value giving to the historic details found on the exterior interior. I've run into the problem with low appraisals on some listings because of this. In addition, comps from 6 months back are very difficult to find, and some of the most incredible historic homes, incredible, what did I do? In addition, some of the most incredible historic homes where you just don't find good comparables. The property is then under appraised and the sales price is definitely below value. So I believe from talking to Paul, he works in an area that has like a lot of these old Victorian, like 100+ year old homes. And because the marketplace for those is small, typically those neighborhoods are only blocks long, as opposed to the entire city. Comps are probably a bear. So can you comment to the challenges an appraiser might have with regards to a grand old Victorian where in those literally 3-block radius, one might not have sold for the last year?
That one's tough. It's probably one of the hardest to appraise. So in that situation, the normal thing to do would be, you would have to find current sales. And I saw, this will probably lead into someone else's question because I saw something pop up, if there's no sales within 6 to 12 months. What you would do is you would go to the next neighboring community that shared those same influences and maybe get your sales from there, go back into your own community, and then maybe go back 2 years or 3 years. And it's really tough with what we've experienced in the last year in the market, where normally it's more steady. So you can see there's a much slower appreciation rate. So you can kind of figure it out, quantify that difference, and then make the adjustment. So it will get you there, and it'll get you to a report that, even though there's a lot of data going on within that report, it'll make sense to underwriting because you're getting something current from a neighboring town, but you're still using your own location to determine that value. So you're doing both. You're just using older sales, but to fast forward, if you tried to do that today, it wouldn't necessarily work going back into your own market like that. So you may just stick to going into neighboring communities that have homes that are historic. The only difference to that is if they're just old and not historic, you're probably gonna have a short appraisal. If they're historic, you can work a little hard. They're much more lenient with what you can do. So there's gonna be a lot more flexibility on the appraisal side with underwriting. If it's just an older home, it's just tough. It's like you may want to really look at, the other sales and listings and things like that before it even gets to the appraiser and have that information ready. That's kind of goes back to the original conversation of have all those improvements ready, have a list. Appraisers are lazy. If you hand it to them, they'll use it. If you don't, they're probably going to get 30% of what you said. So I think that that's a huge part of what they do. And if you make it easy for them, I think that everybody wins. Not that you should do their job for them, but something like that where maybe you're a lot more familiar than somebody walking through a property for 15 minutes is a big deal.
Yeah, having a nice list set up for them. I want to get into something that didn't show up in our questions because I think a lot of people think that, well, these are just Jessica's rules. These are her guidelines. Like, so the question is, or it's this Joe the appraiser that underappraised my house for 20 grand. Those are the rules that Joe made up. So where do the guidelines in the rules that you guys have to appraise these, where do those originate? I mean, is that coming from Fannie Mae, FHA? Like, is there an appraisal god out there that let us know what we have to do? Like, where do the rules come from?
So it's teetering between, so us as appraisers, we have our own rules and set of guidelines. There's nothing in an appraiser's rules that says you have to use a sale within 6 months. You have to use a sale within a year. Within Fannie Mae's guidelines, so you have to be able to sell it and it has to close. They have to have a usable report. So the big, it's like a hidden secret underlying rule that's been around for about 10, 15 years. 2 sales have to be equal to or greater than the amount that you appraise it at. So it actually, those sales have to be closed sales. So originally we had asked that question, how do we exceed the sales price and actually get it through underwriting? You usually don't. There are random situations that do occur, but most of the time, if you don't have those 2 sales that are supporting it, the underwriter will come back and say, okay, I need another sale to support value. So that's a huge trigger on their end, but that is probably the main guideline. not mine. But from the flip side of it, on the appraisal side, our rules are basically don't lie, cheat, and steal. I mean, they just put it into a very large book in appraiser terms, but it's really very vague, and it's more of a guidance. It's more of an ethical guidance, I think, than anything. There are things you can and cannot do, but it's not specific like underwriting. So most of our rules as appraisers are based around underwriting guidelines that are set forth between Fannie Mae and HUD.
And one thing that I could speak to reference to that, you know, if our appraisers that Jessica manages are doing a great job, when our underwriters get to it, I don't have to go back and do extra work. And it would appear that for the most part, I can think of literally 2 loans I've done in the last 2 years where we've had to go back and do some extra work. So our people are pretty spot on. I want to cover something Mike asked and in here, and it's also on our list of questions. And you kind of touched on it as well. There's a couple other little things in here, but you mentioned on the Victorian, hey, you can go back a year or 2. And I think when you said, hey, going back a year or 2 to try to find an older Victorian, what Jessica meant when she says it's not going to make sense is because the market's completely changed from 2 years ago, obviously. We've had averaging 10% appreciation the last 2 years. Going back that far is probably not going to help you, regrettably. Ultimately, though, the question comes up many times, not only here in the chat, Jessica, but in our list of questions we had on the poll, how far back can an appraiser go for comps?
Fannie Mae tells you you can go back as far as you need to, but it's not true. You'll never close a loan if you go beyond a year. Okay. So we've had it numerous times. We do a lot of complex properties that, you know, shouldn't be done, but you can get them done. But that's where it comes to getting creative and maybe us helping them and guiding them through it, going to those neighboring communities. And then, so then you have the mix of both. You have your location, you have your actual value of your community, and then you're getting current sales to meet those guidelines from somewhere else.
Okay. And I think the one thing about being able to go back that far, if you're I'll use a production subdivision as a classic example. If you're in a production subdivision and you have 20 comps in the last 6 months, but you have the comp that makes your value that's 11.5 months ago, they're going to say, look, there's no reason to avoid these 20 comps that don't make your value to go back 11.5 months. You have to justify going that deep into the history books to use that, correct?
Exactly. Yeah. Anytime there's a newer sale, Fannie Mae says the newer sale basically trumps the previous sale. So if something new is available, and that's probably one of the rules that even on the appraisal side that it falls into both. So if something is newer and available, and then that reflects a declining market too. So that's how they're looking at it. And they're saying, okay, well, if it's declining, now what's going on? What's happening? And so it brings over a whole bunch of other questions.
Yeah. Well, and this is a really good question, and we start talking about, and I wanted to make this comment earlier. So I truly think appraising is more art than science. And I guess, do you agree with me on that, Jessica?
I do. I think it's a mix of both. You know, the appraisal side is the art, and then when you get to underwriting, it's the science.
That's a good point. So, all right, Judy had a great question, and I'm not sure. I'm curious if on Judy's question, if this was for the same property, because I have my feelings on an answer if it's not. Different appraisers, here's the question. Different appraisers have different adjustment values. For example, for a 1-car garage, one appraiser might give the garage a $7,000 value, but another appraiser might give that garage a $3,000 value. Since this is an opinion, how do we account for the difference? And let's ask that question as it relates to, first, the same property, and second, maybe just different properties in general.
So when they go back to appraisers and we say, okay, how do you make your adjustment? It's supposed to be off match pair analysis. So you're taking 2 identical properties, extracting that one item, and then figuring out the difference in between. In reality, that's not really what happens. I think what happens is an appraiser gets comfortable in his market, and he maybe does 500 appraisals, and within that 500, he's been adjusting that same amount over a period of time. It's really hard to battle appraisers on their adjustments. there's nothing that's really clear or defined that you can go back and say, okay, well, I mean, unless we were to go in and do a full analysis and actually be able to extract that, which would take endless hours to do, it's pretty hard to fight them on it. But they all make different ones. And that's actually a great question, because there is no sense or rhyme or reason to it. And
So one thing, and this will kind of, with the garage, maybe this makes sense on the garage, but I want to make a better example. We had an appraisal recently in Rolling Meadows, and the conversation was, hey, the finished basement, they only gave that like 10,000. I just had an appraisal in Arlington Heights where the basement value was 25,000. Those two communities, while next to each other, we're probably talking about two completely different valued properties. Maybe Arlington Heights is pushing 500-600, where the Rolling Meadows property is pushing 275 to 3. I think the value of a basement, you can't stamp it as 10,000 because it varies based on the neighborhood. Would you agree with that?
Absolutely. And the usage, does one community have a lot of kids? What would they need that maybe another community doesn't have? So maybe they want a bigger yard. Maybe they want a finished basement. Maybe they need, an enclosed garage. Maybe they need that extra unit to store all their kids' junk. So there's all these different things that do come into place that do impact the value. And looking at it from a buyer standpoint, a buyer would pay more for those things if they had that need. And they tend to gravitate towards different communities. So there's a huge, if one community maybe is made up of younger couples that are recently, married, and they're both working and they don't have kids, or they have one child, they're not going to have the same need as somebody who has 2 or 3 kids that needs all this extra storage and all these different things. So those factors come into play.
Let's see here. So the question, I think, Anthnita, we answered this question. There was a question she asked in here: if we don't have any comps within the last six or 12 months, what would you recommend finding the best comp for a subject property? Again, may be able to go back over 12 months, may be able to go a little bit outside of area. So those would be 2 good things. Any other suggestions?
That's really it. That's all you can do. It may be the neighboring community that matches yours might be 20, 30 miles away. So it becomes a situation where what is typical and what's normal, maybe normally we wouldn't exceed 2 to 3 miles, but now we're 25, 30 miles out, and that's okay. That is workable, and that's something you can do versus using something that's 2 years old.
Got it.
It's just you're kind of switching gears and working with something completely different.
Yeah, and I have seen appraisers, I have seen comps come in where they're going across into a different suburb because the home is very similar, the age of the home is similar, everything is really identical, and going into a different suburb may literally be the distance of 0.75 miles.
Right.
So, it's possible to do that on appraisals. Bobby, I would ask you to give me a little clarification of this question, and just because I'm not quite sure what we're arguing for on there. So if you can clarify that, I'd appreciate that. All right. So Paul, who is our historic home realtor, once again, with an historic home, a VA appraiser came in. One thing I do have to comment about a VA appraisal: I can't use Jessica for a VA appraisal because VA has its own appraisers and we have to live with their decisions. Anyway, moving right along. So VA appraiser came in and appraised the house significantly less than the contract. The deal fell through. Then the new offer with a conventional loan had an appraiser determine the value more than 10% above the VA appraisal. Supposedly VA and conventional appraisals are looking at the same criteria. Great question. Jessica, you want to comment on that?
I could send 10 appraisers out to appraise that same property and everybody would give me a different value. It's just kind of what he said, the art form part of it. The data is there and there is information, but you're going to have different opinions. And it happens to us all the time where we'll reorder an appraisal and it comes in significantly higher or lower. It's just 2 different opinions. They look, some people walk in, they love the house. Some people think it's old and clunky and it needs repairs. So I think, if you are present for that inspection, or if you have something that's maybe you're a little unsure about, maybe be present or give him the information, leave it there, email it to him, whatever you want to do to solidify, your list price or your contract price and whatever you can do. But that happens all the time and it'll continue to happen forever and ever and ever. There's no way. I mean, think about when you go in to list your property, how much data is available, how many sales are available, and what criteria you might use to extract the ones that you want or you feel are comparable. Each appraiser is doing that, but in their own way. So they might be setting different boundaries for their neighborhood. They might be, maybe one person's using 15%, maybe another person's using 20% as a gauge for square footage or bedroom counts and things like that. So all these things can impact that final number.
So next question that we had on here, Jessica, is, well, I may be able to get this, but is there a place where somebody could go online and actually see Fannie Mae underwriting guidelines for appraisals?
You can, they're just overwhelming. They're right on Fannie Mae's website. If you just type in Fannie Mae appraisal guidelines, you'll be able to pull it right up. But there's endless sections. Each one is very specific. It pertains to certain things. So it's not a clear list where you can say, okay, well, here's my checklist. Even for FHA, it's not clear. So it's unfortunately, there's not a great guide, but the information is there. So if you're looking for something specific, it is there. It's available on their website.
Yeah, and I agree with you that FHA section is the FHA appraisal section, and the Fannie Mae conventional, if you will, appraisal section is a sleeping read. I mean, it's really tough. It's really tough to get through. It really is. So I'm going to take a question off our list. I'll get back to the chat line in a second, but this is kind of in a different slant than I wanted addressed, and I'm sure our agents here do. Is seller paid closing costs impacting values today?
It is. This is another one where it kind of goes back to the adjustments thing, but not every appraiser will adjust on concessions and things like that. But I would say overall, yes, it does impact it. They'll take that full amount and deduct it off of those sales. And sometimes that can be brutal to that final number. So they do look at it and they do take it into consideration. I've seen sales that the concessions were logged wrong. You know, maybe somebody just shortcutted it and they just threw in whatever, and those weren't actually the concessions. And if you dug a little deeper, you could find out. And I'm not saying that's the case every time, but if we have a file that maybe is really tight on value and we have an appraiser going in and making a massive adjustment on these concessions, and we can prove otherwise, we can get it taken off or we can minimize it. So that's something to think about if that ever happens.
Yeah, I got it. And that's one of the reasons why we can't appraise property without a signed contract, because those appraisers want to see that contract. They want to see what went in there, and they want to see, you know, if there was a lot of closing costs, is that potentially one of the reasons why we're dramatically over list? So, you know, those are questions that'll factor into the decision. Let's see here. So Judy, again, you could look that up. I'll see if I can get you something on the guidelines that some sort of link. So don't print it unless you have a whole ream of paper though. All right, moving on. So we kind of addressed this a little bit. You know, it's what distance from the subject can you go? You can go, you know, we have addressed that, but that's pretty much the distance within reason. Yep. So, you know, within reason, you can go miles away. But it has to be within reason and justified. And don't forget, if the appraiser goes there, it doesn't mean underwriting is going to agree. Let's see here. Do they look for comps that close the last 12 months or 6? They will go back 12 months on comps. We've addressed that. Let's see here. Could go back 7 years. Go back 7 years comps, then adjust for. That's an interesting question. So Bobby asks, can you go back several years for comps, then adjust for inflation to bring the price up to date? My immediate thought would be, if there's comps in between, probably not. So
you can, but it's a very tough number to be able to support. You know, if the market's not constant, how do you do that? You know, right now it's just a roller coaster. It's up and down. So in a normal situation where we had a steadier market, you could do something like that, but it wouldn't fly. You would still need your current sales. They'd still want to say, especially if you started doing that, they'd say, okay, give me sales within 6 months. Again, those might be from a neighboring community or complex. It doesn't really matter, but you're going to have both in order to be able to push forward with that deal.
Yeah. So the question I'm going to pull off of our sheet that we had on our poll was, for a conventional loan, does the appraiser care about a working furnace? I'm going to answer that.
Okay.
Yeah, Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac would like that home to be in move-in condition. Now, it doesn't have to be pristine. It probably doesn't even have to be whatever your standards might be. But in Chicago, they would like to see a working furnace. So that has to be. Now, the appraiser is going to go through the house and say, furnace not working at the time of inspection, which is going to trigger underwriting to go, hey, we need a furnace inspection on that property. Mike, did you want to add anything else to that, Jessica? Because that's really.
I actually want to add, it's a little random, but it goes back to something similar. I had a conversation with HUD this past week, and the question that I had was, can we show that the utilities are on and operable via generator instead of utilities? Because there are weird situations where you can't get the utilities on. They actually said no. I thought they would say yes and allow for it, because the point wasn't that the utilities had to be on. I mean, you want to see that everything is operating, the mechanics of the home are operating. You would be able to facilitate that with a generator, but they said no.
No, that's
a random side note.
Yeah, no, that's unique. As a segue to that, if the plumbing is not on and the appraiser says, okay, by the way, we weren't able to view that the plumbing's on, and again, underwriting's going to see that note. They're going to say, hey, get a plumber out there, verify that the pipes are in good working order. If you cannot get a plumber out there, or let's say more importantly, you can't get that water turned on, a pressure test by a plumber would be acceptable to pretty much any agency. So that's a plumber who has the ability to put air pressure in there and test that system to make sure it's actually holding air, which is essentially the same thing as water. So we've been able to get those approved through underwriting. So Mike asks, how does an appraiser factor in areas with large plots of land? So 1 acre versus 2 acres versus 5. Is it still the 20% rule? Meaning that if our comps on 2 acres, we're really not bringing any more comps that are over 3 acres. What's the guideline on acreage?
With acreage, it needs to be bracketed. So you want something bigger and smaller. But keep in mind that in that exact scenario, bigger isn't better. So what happens is the larger your lot, the less return you're going to get as it grows, because it's not usable. So if I have 3 acres sitting behind me and nobody can access it because my house is in the front, my value of that back land is worth nothing. If it's maybe sitting in the front, it can be divided. So there's all kinds of little things that go around bigger lots. But we do a ton of rural properties all through the US. And the big thing is to bracket it. So if you have a 2 acre lot, maybe you want to show a 1 acre lot, a 2 acre lot, and a 5 acre lot. And it gets a little trickier when you're dealing with big parcels because the homes are so different. You have a lot of unzoned areas. The restrictions are a lot lower. So you can kind of build whatever you want most of the time in these areas. So it gets a little trickier, but the big thing is just 20% guide is good. And then bracketing that acreage.
Excellent. All right. So Paul says garages are a good example of what the actual value is. If one comp has no garage and the other has a 2-car garage, the appraiser may only give an adjustment of $10,000, when in reality, a new 2-car garage would cost $20,000 to build. Why is the adjustment only $10,000 when the cost to add it would be $20,000? Great question.
Cost doesn't equal value. Even when we do new construction communities, and we do a lot of them, you'll see the difference. A resale versus a new build won't have that same value. You'll pay full value for that garage up front, might cost you $25,000. But the reality is, once it hits that resale market, you're going to see a completely different adjustment applied. Again, there's no good way to extract that. It would have to be so clear in that market, and it's not possible, because then you have upgrades and then you have all these other things that start coming into place. So it's part of it is it's not clear on extracting it, and there's nobody that says this is what's the average for this market, so let's just adjust this across the board. And if they did, it would make it a lot easier. Sometimes good, sometimes bad, but we don't have that. So they're always going to work off of it. The rule is supposed to be on the appraisal side that what would a buyer pay coming in today for that garage? I don't think they're going to pay full price. I mean, if they would, why not buy a house with no garage and build one?
Right. Right.
You know, it just doesn't work that way.
Right. Yeah, and I think it goes back to, they talk about, where do you get the most bang out of your buck for improvements? So you're going to put the garage up, but you're not going to get dollar for dollar return on that garage, even though the cost is there. So Josh has a great question. He says, besides being extremely busy right now, speaking of appraisers, is the longer appraisal time due to the fact that there is a shortage of appraisers?
So only about 60% of appraisers are back in the field appraising. So the reality is most appraisers are over 50, which wipes out most of the people going in to do inspections. So those people won't go into homes and do inspections. So there is a shortage. If everybody was actually back at work, I don't think we would, even as busy as we are. I think our turn times would be just as normal. And that applies everywhere across the country. I mean, you guys don't really have it too bad where you're at, but there's places that are horrendous. It's 2 months to get an appraisal, just a regular old standard appraisal. I mean, you might only have 5 or 6 appraisers that are, up and working and able to facilitate it. So it's not even optional. It's not even, I'll pay you more, because they're just not available. So yes, there is a shortage of appraisers. I don't know with this vaccine, how that's going to impact things, if people are going to kind of try to go back to normal, and we'll see, a shift. And then I think we'll see a shift in the market anyway, but it'll probably balance itself out towards the end of the year.
Yeah, that's interesting, guys. I don't want to kind of enlighten you about what's going on in some of these other markets as it relates to appraisers. I was on a call with a bunch of other lenders from the West Coast, and maybe Jessica can verify this. And one of the gentlemen on was either from Phoenix or somewhere in California, and they were telling somebody, look, if you wanted to pay our standard fee for an appraisal, let's say it's $500, we're not closing this loan for about 2 months. If you want your loan closed in 30 days, that's a rush, and the appraisal fee will be $1,100. It's really up to you what you want to do, but it's at $1,100 or $1,200. Is that what they're seeing on the West Coast for some of these rushes?
For an average appraisal that's taking about a week to 10 days, it's $1,500. Just a regular house, standard for the community. They're considering that a rush. Is it a rush? I don't think so, but the market tells us otherwise. So yeah, the only people getting stuck with it is the people buying the homes, but they're okay with it. They seem to be happy about it. I mean, I think it's you guys are really lucky where you're at in the market you're in, considering, this shift. But yeah, that's completely normal out there right now.
Wow, that's crazy. All right. Commercial cash option to get the mortgage, avoid the appraisal contingency hassle. Okay, I think Marilyn just made a statement about multiple offers, see more cash to get a mortgage. Community cash, okay, it avoids appraisal contingency hassle, of course. Appraisal advantage, broker doing market analysis does not ensure the result. Third-party buyers are like the rival value. The result of competition. Appraiser does have sales price used determining a value. Interesting. I think that's a statement rather than a question. Let me go into another question. This is an interesting question. This came from a realtor that I had polled, Jessica, that was an appraiser, probably over a decade ago. And he said, why do certain appraisers count? This is a great question, actually. I'm surprised we didn't touch on this before. Why do certain appraisers count below grade space as in their gross living area, also known as GLA? So let's start there first, because we see it all the time. When we say, describe for everybody, Jessica, above grade and below grade.
So below grade would be anything, if any portion of a level falls below grade, the entire level gets discounted. So if I'm walking out my back door, it's completely open, I'm at level with my backyard, but I go towards the front of my home and I have half of a window, that bottom level does not count. So that rule is actually, it's extinct. We're not technically supposed to be counting that lower level. There is a rule around it. Fannie Mae says you could count that lower level if you do it all the way across the board with all your sales. So if I do it for mine, I can do it all the way across the board. But I can tell you that the few times we've attempted it, I actually just had a file yesterday, it got kicked back. The same thing happened. I had 2 appraisals done. One appraiser discounted the whole thing. The other one counted it, and she did it the correct way. She applied the Fannie Mae rule, and they kicked it back and said, take it all out and reverse it. So you're not supposed to. It doesn't mean you're going to get less value. I mean, sometimes I think that's just this idea that the adjustment just shifts. So maybe you're getting, you know, a $25,000 adjustment in square footage, but now it's shifting to a finished basement. So it's, if the appraiser knows what he's doing, you're not going to lose value. It's just how he writes it up.
And so what, and think guys, when you see, you know, what's really common in our market are these raised ranches, and, you know, the raised ranch, that lower level is typically embedded in the ground somewhere, whether it's front or back. And on that lower level, you'll see a rec room, maybe a bathroom and a laundry room. If it's below grade, none of it counts in the GLA or gross living area. So a lot of times that's an argument that I'll get is, hey, you know, why aren't they counting the lower level? They're really not. It's a finished basement with a bedroom and a bathroom. And according to appraisal guidelines, that's really the best that they can do with it. So the follow-up to that is, so there really shouldn't be any appraisers that treat it differently. Below grade is below grade. It doesn't count in gross living area because, again, as you guys just heard, Jessica's company tried to do it differently and the lender said, nope, sorry, we're not going to take it. Next point that I've got on here, this is a follow-up to that. So I know the answer to this, but would it be different from state to state? In other words, would I be able to count the basement in Indiana, but not in Illinois?
No, and it is much more typical in certain areas, especially beachfront communities. There's a lot of that. But no, essentially it all comes back. Even if the appraiser does it, it won't get through underwriting. So it's kind of just a waste of time for everybody involved when that happens, because essentially it's coming back from the underwriting team. And that may skew all the sales that they did have. So, you know, if you're working with the appraiser, a lot of times on those types of homes, I think the agents get involved, but that's something to consider before you're handing over those sales. Just know that it's going to be half of whatever it is, because we're discounting that bottom level. And again, they'll account for it in other ways. It's just getting it written up correctly.
All right, let's see. Mike says, I'm hearing that appraisers will try to reach the selling price whenever possible. Is this true, or do appraisers stick strictly to the data? Contract be damned.
I think it's a combination of both. You know, the whole big thing with the only reason AMCs even exist is because appraiser independence and all these things. But the reality is, if you put a number in front of anybody, it's probably going to skew their opinion. So when I have a signed contract in front of me and I know the value, I'm probably going to be looking a little differently than if I completely went in blind, had no idea what it was or anything like that. So I think that they do try to, and again, that is a reflection of the market. So you have a signed contract, somebody's willing to pay it. I mean, that has to carry weight on its own, you know, and so I think it's a little bit of both.
Yeah,
no, the contract definitely helps.
Absolutely. Well, it's funny too, because I'll mention to people before this market happened, I would mention to people like, hey, your house over appraised by like 5,000. And they'll be this again, not this market, but hey, your house over appraised by 5,000. And they'll say, wow, boy, we thought it was going to be another 25,000. And a lot of times I'll tell them, I'm like, you know, to be honest with you, the appraiser, you know, probably was there, but he or she knows that if he gives us 30,000 over, guess who's going to ask questions? Underwriting. And guess what that means? They're going to have to go back and do more work on this file to establish why they appraised it $30,000 more. It doesn't make a lot of sense, regrettably. And you guys have to know that the appraised value is not really for the buyer, it's for the lender. I mean, truly at the end of the day, this is about what does the lender feel comfortable with, not necessarily the value of the property that somebody's willing to pay for it, unfortunately. Couple other follow-ups that go back in the lower level space. Jeff and Pat says, this is actually a really good question because I don't know the answer to this either. What has to be finished on the lower level in order for it to be counted as finished space? And I think, like, is there a percentage of the lower level that's got to be finished? Like, can you finish?
You'll get value based on the percentage. So it wouldn't matter. It could be 50% or the full level. But as far as the rooms, I mean, you want to focus in on bedrooms, bathrooms. there's some things that just don't give you value, and nobody wants to hear it, but all these upgrades, your countertops and all these great things in your bamboo floors, nobody cares. There's no place to even adjust on the appraisal for it. So it's amazing from a purchaser standpoint, but from an appraisal standpoint, none of those things help. I mean, you could have a standard floor and have those homes identical. They'll probably appraise exactly the same if the bedroom counts and the bathrooms are there. So keep in mind, there are over improvements and people get really upset when appraisers don't account for it. But even if they wanted to account for it, there's nowhere to account for those, very specific, very personal type of upgrades that people put in. But lower level, I would say basement, the bedrooms and the bathrooms are what gives it the most value. That's where the biggest adjustment is.
Cool. That helps answers Christina's next question. And all right, oh, this is another property we see a lot, property style we see a lot of here in Chicago. So the question from, I think this is from, I can't read who this came from. Oh, from John. Question from John is, but you can always compare a tri-level sale to tri-level comps and raised ranches to raised ranch comps. Just will have problem comparing multi-level sale to a ranch or two-story comps. Isn't that correct? So did you understand that, or sorry,
I did.
Sorry.
I think the main thing he's asking is there's a functionality difference between the two. So he's saying, okay, can you take a raised ranch and compare it to 2 stories? No, you can't, because the function of the home is different. So, maybe a bi-level and a split level might be much more similar as far as how you're using them, but a 2-story throws it completely out of whack. So no, it wouldn't be a good comparison. So you are correct.
Okay. Judy says, is there value given to a finished walkout versus just a finished basement?
No.
Yeah, I mean, I think a buyer might be willing to pay a little bit more for a walkout. So maybe, but I mean, it's aesthetically, I guess, a little bit more appealing. Let's see what we have on our poll. I think we're caught up in.
Well, let me backtrack to that though, because if it's a walkout, you're essentially counting that lower level. You're giving it more because it's probably finished like your upper level. So it goes back to the below grade, above grade. But if it's just a basement, it's just going to be a finished basement. So they're almost not really one and the same. If that makes sense.
Yeah, no, I agree with you. I agree with you. They're almost always going to be finished because you can't walk out the back and it's almost treated like another level, at least in whoever had its mind. So here's a good question. It's not on our, there was a question on here which talking about what is written up. We'll address the question. I got a good follow-up for it, Jessica. Conventional appraisal versus FHA appraisal. What are you seeing from appraisers that they would necessarily flag as far as property repairs, and they don't, keep in mind, their appraiser never says, hey, fix this. It's an observation of something that they don't think is correct or right. And then of course an underwriter has to read that and says, oh, we need a roof inspection, for example, if the shingles are falling off. So what do you see? What's the most common thing you see, Jessica, that an FHA appraiser would write up than a conventional appraiser wouldn't write up as it relates to property condition?
The big thing is mechanicals, if the furnace isn't working, if things like that. Another one is like a broken window. A handrail is another one. The biggest thing to remember with FHA is safety. If you can hurt yourself, if you trip, if the staircase or if the stair is broken, and the concrete is raised, that's an FHA hazard. It wouldn't fall under conventional. If there's no flooring, so you're not actually required to have flooring in homes. You can have subflooring, but if you rip out that carpet and there's nails in the floor, that's an FHA hazard. So that would be something that people don't expect to see, but it happens all the time. If they repaired the paint, but then the chips from the paint are still around, wherever that repair was, that calls for an FHA inspection. So I think the key is knowing if you walk in and an appraiser's coming out for an FHA inspection, if they can't see it, they're probably not going to report it. We don't go digging under things, it's just what's in front of us. So look around and You know, that's what they're seeing. So if they can't see it, they don't know it's there. You know, if there's a big spot of mold on the wall, maybe you want to get that white paint out and do a little before
Push
they
the
come.
couch up, push the couch up against the wall is what you're
Yes,
saying?
yeah, if they
So-
can't see it, they're not going to report it. So I think that's this huge thing. Again, they don't open, I mean, they're going to test the water, flush the toilets and basic things, but they're not really digging in. It's not a home inspection.
Yeah, and there's two comments I made, things that I've heard realtors do, not that I would ever suggest, but things I've heard agents do is, you know, if you've got mold in a basement, maybe there was a water problem, maybe the sump pump went out, everything's great, but you never bothered to address it, take a straight razor to it and just cut that drywall out of there, get it out of there. You know, why are you putting that in front of an appraiser? There's no reason for that. So I know a lot of agents who have taken a straight razor and just cut those sections of drywall out beforehand. I do have a funny story about an agent who called me about a pipe that was in the middle of the backyard on some an older home where they had the fuel source was buried out in the backyard, and they were really panicked about what if they see the pipe, what is the appraiser going to ask? And I could tell you that's going to be a nightmare for underwriting. If they know there's an underground oil tank somewhere out in the middle of the yard at an FHA, somebody's going to ask questions about what the safety is and potentially even worse, dig it up, that kind of thing. So when I saw the appraisal come in and I saw the picture, oddly in the middle of the backyard was this plastic house, like kid's house. Just not anywhere, just it was in the middle of the backyard. I think there might have been a pipe under it, but I didn't know. Anyway, so let's see what else we have here. Let's see here. Is that true for VA too? Claire asks, so I believe when we were talking about the repair items, she asks if that's true for VA. So I think, correct me if I'm wrong, VA, their things they're going to cite on the appraisal are going to mirror FHA, what they're going to cite.
And USDA.
Okay.
So all those are the same.
Peeling paint is going to be an issue for VA.
VA tends to fall, so USDA mirrors FHA, same exact guidelines. VA kind of falls in between. So you do have a little more flexibility with some of those repairs. But the flip side of that is if the appraiser calls it, but still makes it as is, it's going to get stuck in underwriting and they're going to make it a condition to repair
Got
it.
it. So Claudia asked about, and you touched on this, and I'm glad it kind of came up. So she asked about, what do you mean when you say mechanicals? Yeah, did you see that one?
Yeah. So the funny thing about FHA is you're not required to have a dishwasher. If you have a dishwasher, it has to work. If you have a microwave, it has to work. So if you guys know it doesn't work, take it out, get rid of it, because then they either have to replace it or do something with it, or it has to be repaired. It just creates a problem that shouldn't even exist. So that goes down to the AC unit. Anything that can be turned on and off that powers in the house, I guess, essentially is a mechanical. So you have your furnace, your AC units, any type
Hot
of
water tank,
your toilets, dishwasher is a huge one. People get conditioned on it all the time. Then they have to call somebody to repair it. They have to pay for another final inspection. There's all these things that happen when it could have been a really cheap fix. You know, maybe you just call Salvation Army, tell them to come pick it up and take it away or whatever you're going to do. But if it's there, it has to operate.
And when Jessica's talking about microwaves, she's talking about built-in microwaves, not the one on the counter. So if it's built in,
on the counter though, it has to just get rid of it.
Yeah.
If it doesn't work, get rid of it.
There you go. All right. So especially because wanted to have rains. Okay. If a basement gets some water during heavy rains, will this not pass FHA or conventional? It's kind of a loaded question.
It is, but the thing is, if you know there's rain and it's something you can clean it up. Don't put yourself in that predicament, because now he's going to call for a foundation inspection. They call for all kinds of things that cost thousands of dollars that it's such an easy fix. But to answer your question, no, it won't pass.
Yeah, won't pass. It's gonna require further inspections and a letter be in our file that somebody, foundation company looked at it and says, hey, this place is okay. What about personal property on a contract? So, I mean, this is great. Builder side decides to sell the model. They sell all the furniture in it. The furniture is assessed at a value, let's say, of 30,000, just for a round number. What does that look like on an appraisal?
It looks like nothing because they can't give any value to it. So it's completely extracted. It's disregarded like it never existed.
So all personal property, this is a good note. This is why you don't put personal property. You list it on the contract. If you list it on the contract, if you don't put a value on it, underwriting is going to come back and say, what is the value? And they're going to deduct it from that sales price. So it would be better that it wasn't itemized or listed as the sale of personal property. So, all right. So it has to be, Judy says it has to be on property disclosures. I think that's what she's talking. Oh, so this is good. So with the basement follow-up, and this is a great question. So this is a good question. So there's a seller's disclosure here in Illinois. I'm sure a lot of other states have it, but in Illinois, we have a seller's disclosure. And one of the seller's disclosure is, are you aware that the basement leaks? Two things about that. Number one, we cross country, we do not require that disclosure, period, at all. That disclosure, the reason we don't require it, because it's not required by FHA, Fannie Mae, Freddie Mac. Anybody we sell this loan to doesn't want to see the disclosure. If you have as an agent, provide your lender that disclosure, yes, you are going to now have the follow-up question of, send somebody out that can prove that the foundation is okay. You're going to generate that. Now, I know for a fact other banks require that disclosure. That's their personal guidelines or their personal rules, has nothing to do with what agency wants. One of the reasons that we've grown the way we have and been so successful across country is we're not looking for that. And I want to add one other thing. No time ever should you be giving your lender a copy of a home inspection. That is just a recipe for disaster. We don't need it. I've seen people say, well, we had a bad foundation. Let's get the home inspection because I'm sure the home inspector said it was okay. Now you just gave the underwriter every detail of everything that's wrong with that house. And if there's anything in there they're not comfortable with, you'll be fixing that too. Don't provide the home inspection. It's not necessary. All right. So yeah. So with regards to Judy's comment, if it's on the disclosures, we don't need it. So we're a little bit past our time, and we usually allot an hour for this. I think we've got all the really good questions, but Jessica, do you have any kind of closing comments for our agents? Let's see how we, any closing comments for our agents?
Just to add on to your last comment about the home inspection, appraisers can only disclose what you tell them. If there's something that's happened that's already been rectified in a property, just keep it to yourself. You don't need to share it. Less is more in that situation. If it's not positive for that exact moment, then probably keep it to yourself. And all these things are really just to get you to closing faster and get the deal done. That's it.
Yeah, and the one comment I'll make about the home inspection, number one, I'm glad your buyer's getting a home inspection. Number two, that disclosure that I don't need has to go to the buyer. So anything that was listed there, they're fully aware of what they're getting into, assuming that they've read it and their agent on their side said, hey, by the way, just so you know, we've got whatever this issue is. So as a lender, if the agency doesn't want it, I don't need it. I appreciate the comments that we're getting from everybody. Jessica, I super appreciate your time. So thank you very much. You guys, don't be too jealous of Jessica. She's in Fort Lauderdale while we're all bracing for snow. It actually has snowed already in the southern suburbs. So yeah, you don't have those problems, right?
Nope.
Well, thank you very much, everybody. Thanks, Jessica, for your time. We appreciate you. Thank you, Tony, for keeping my act together and putting this together. And we'll talk to everybody soon.
Bye.
Bye, guys.